You're listening to Politeracy. I'm your producer, Levi Zimmerman, research assistant with the MacEwan University Department of Political Science. On today's episode, our host, Dr. Andrea Wagner, will be discussing Brexit and its implications for Canada with Dr. Achim Hurrelmann from the Carleton University Department of Political Science. Without further ado, here's your host, Dr. Andrea Wagner.
Good morning to everyone. This is the first political science podcast of MacEwan University, recorded by Dr. Andrea Wagner, political science professor at MacEwan, and Jean Monnet Chair, the future of the EU Post Brexit at MacEwan University. Today we have an important day where we are launching the Jean Monnet Chair, and Dr. Achim Hurrelmann is the invited guest speaker from Carleton University. Dr. Achim Hurrelmann is an associate professor of political science. He's also the co-director of the Center of European Studies at Carleton University's Research Center focused on European affairs. He's cross-appointed to the Institute of European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies. Dr. Hurrelmann, welcome.
Glad to be here.
Glad to be here. We are very, very happy that you're here. Today we are launching our Jean Monnet event, and you are going to talk about why Brexit matters for Canada. Let me congratulate you again on air now for receiving another, is this number 4, SSHRC grant in 2019 on the Reconfiguration of Canada-Europe relations after Brexit. So over the next 5 years, you're going to study, research this topic in depth. Can you tell us more about it?
Yeah, so I'm quite excited. So we got this grant. I'm saying we because it's really a team. I'm the principal investigator, as SSHRC calls it, but the other team members are Frédéric Meron from Université de Montréal, Patrick Leblanc from University of Ottawa, and Petra Dolata from the University of Calgary. So the objective of this project is really to follow in real time, if you will, how the UK's withdrawal from the EU, which will occur in January 31st, 2020, how it will affect relations with Canada. And this is an open question. I don't have an answer to that if you ask me that question now. That's why it needs to be studied. So the question is, what is the future of the economic relationship where Canada and the EU currently trade with each other under the so-called Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, CETA. But when the United Kingdom leaves the EU after the end of the transition period, CETA will no longer apply to the UK. What does that mean for Canada-UK trade? There might have to be, should probably be a new trade agreement for this bilateral relationship between Canada and the UK. So that will have to be negotiated, but it's also a question of, for instance, what happens to Canadian companies who have invested in the UK, not just to serve the British market, but also to serve with their products or services the markets in the EU, in the other remaining member states. And here, Canada really is at the mercy of the negotiations that are ongoing between the EU and the UK, where Canada doesn't have any direct stake, but Canadian companies might be strongly affected by the outcomes. So that's the whole economic angle, but we are also looking at other policy fields like security relations, like environmental and energy relations. We have someone working on research and access to research funds. And then the last core element of this project is the discursive or identity dimension, where the question is, does this debate about Brexit have any implications on how Canada sees itself as an international actor? We have seen in Canada some political controversy about Brexit with, for instance, Andrew Scheer, the Conservative leader, being very vocal that he is in favor of Brexit, whereas Justin Trudeau, for instance, has been quite critical of Brexit. And they have tried to politicize this issue domestically in interesting ways. So this is also something that we are studying. And the overarching question is, how does Canada see see itself? Does it see itself as part of the Anglosphere, just sort of working on a new close relationship with a newly independent United Kingdom? Or is Canada now part of something that is maybe we could call the Eurosphere because of the very close relationships that have developed with the European Union? These were not in contradiction to each other while the UK was in the EU, but now the question is, how do these relationships develop? Is there any potential for conflict or debate, or just a reconfiguration of Canada's global role?
Excellent. Let's go back a little bit to 2016, right? And I remember that day very clearly because I should have had a meeting with Dr. Hurrelmann, and that meeting was canceled because all of a sudden the British have decided to leave the European Union. So let's go down memory lane a little bit. Were you surprised by Brexit June 16th, 2016, or did you anticipate these results?
Well, I knew that it would be close, but I did believe the opinion polls before the referendum that indicated that the Remain side would win.
Exactly.
At the same time, it was clear that there was a lot of skepticism in the EU about membership in the European Union. So on that evening before the referendum, I had tasked myself with writing an op-ed that I could pitch to newspapers the following day, and I actually ended up writing two because it was too close to call. So one for the Remain wins and one for Leave wins, but the Remain wins one was more developed because I thought that was more likely. So it turned to be a very long night because I had to finish the other one, and that was only clear, I don't know, at 10 in the night or something.
Yes. So let's go back to it. Were you disappointed? Do you think that the European Union to some extent has failed? And when I say failed to kind of connect with your average citizen in the United Kingdom and demonstrate that EU membership is a value added?
Yeah, definitely. I think so. And I mean, even some leading EU politicians have said that they see Brexit as an indication of failure to win over, as you were saying, the British for the many benefits of European integration. I think there are many benefits. I personally, if I had been a British citizen, I would have voted Remain because it is very beneficial for a member state to be in the EU. You got economic access to a large single market. Your citizens enjoy the freedom of movement into other member states of the European Union. There's lots of programs from the European Union, including, for instance, for students, the Erasmus program of student exchange that people profit from. So there's a lot of benefits, but on the other hand, I think we also must be honest about the concerns that people had about European integration. They are not unique to the United Kingdom. That the the EU is too opaque, is too remote, too far away from the people, not accessible.
Freedom of labor is also controversial.
And then in the British context, there was an additional debate, absolutely, about the inflow of people from other EU member states to work in the UK, which again economically was all to the benefit of the British economy, but raised some concerns about issues of identity, and there were some xenophobic tendencies as well that played a role.
Let's remember the bus.
Yes.
With the incorrect information of how much the UK's how much weekly or bi-weekly the UK's sending or paying the European Union, and let's fund our national healthcare system instead. What do you think? How much did the simultaneously occurring refugee crisis also play into this fear-mongering?
It's an interesting question because the UK was not one of the countries that was really affected by the refugee crisis, because of the island location of the UK. Exactly. There weren't very many refugees coming over the channel to the United Kingdom. But this whole discourse that then started developing in 2015-16 in the European Union and other member states about concerns about too much incoming migration, that I guess did resonate, and some of the pro-Brexit groups did actually draw up posters that alluded to that. But in policy terms, the concern in the UK was much more migration from other European Union member states rather than refugees coming in.
All right, let's stay on the island of Shakespeare. So what is your take on the last 3.5 years in the UK of trying to get Brexit done? And I'm quoting here Boris Johnson, of course. What does it really mean to get Brexit done? Because I think it's more complicated and complex than just ratifying the Brexit bill in the House of Commons, in the House of Lords, and then in the European Parliament.
Oh, certainly, yeah. So, I mean, even with Brexit having occurred on January 31st of 2020, this does not mean that Brexit is done, because the next step of the Brexit negotiation will be to draw up the future relationship between the United Kingdom and the European Union. And only when that is also completed, I think, can we really speak about Brexit being done. So yes, well, the last 3.5 years showed that Brexit was extremely and is extremely complicated, and no one was prepared for it. Even the people who advocated for Brexit did not have any kind of plan for how it could be brought about, what it would even mean. I mean, when Theresa May, the former Prime Minister, was asked what it means, she said Brexit means Brexit, and that, of course, doesn't explain anything.
That's quite tautological.
Yeah, that doesn't explain anything. But she didn't have a better answer because there was none around. No one really knew how Brexit would or should look like, and the people hadn't voted based on any sort of clear model of where they would be going to. And then obviously there was this debate developing between people who thought a rather so-called soft Brexit would be the best solution, which would maintain a very close alignment with the European Union, while others wanted to see a much harder Brexit. And this debate is obviously what totally paralyzed Theresa May's premiership, so that nothing happened during the years, not much happened during the years when she was Prime Minister.
Yes, just to remind my students, soft Brexit means that the United Kingdom is going to leave the European Union but stay in the customs union and single market. And hard Brexit would mean that the United Kingdom is going to leave the single market, which also draws further issues and complications in the context of the Irish border. The backstop agreement will be respected or not. Let's talk a little bit first about Ireland and the Irish border issue and the Good Friday Agreement of 1998, April 12th, right? What's your take on that, Dr. Hurrelmann?
Well, I actually did look up in the Good Friday Agreement what it says about open borders.
You read the whole thing? I read only a little because it's a long agreement.
And the Good Friday Agreement does not directly demand a sort of totally open border. But people say, and I think with good reasons, that the spirit of the agreement does require that a large part of why this agreement was possible and has been successful is because the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland became insignificant for people's day-to-day lives. And both parties in the Brexit negotiations agreed that they wanted to maintain that, so that the border should remain open. And open really meaning no control infrastructure, no checkpoints, and so on. So they agreed on that, but they didn't agree on how that could be brought about.
Yes.
For the British, it seemed to me that they felt that the EU could sort of simply leave that part of its border open and not bother about who goes in and out there, and that for the Europeans was unacceptable. The preferred European solution has been that Northern Ireland remains in
the single market,
and therefore there wouldn't be any in the customs union, and therefore there wouldn't.
The hardcore Tories are very much against
exactly
Northern Ireland staying in the single market, because then they say, well, we're not really leaving the European Union.
And then Theresa May's compromise was that the entirety of the United Kingdom would remain unless there's a better solution found. So that was the so-called backstop. So if no better solution is found, the entirety of the United Kingdom would remain in a common customs territory with the EU. That would have resolved the issue of the Irish border, but there a lot of opposition developed in the UK that said, well, is that really Brexit if we remain so closely aligned? So the new agreement, which has now been ratified by the British Parliament, does not include a backstop, but includes a different solution for Northern Ireland that says essentially that there are customs controls between Northern Ireland and the rest of the United Kingdom, and this will allow then goods between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland to flow in and out freely. And that is also something that was quite controversial because it essentially means an internal border, customs border within the United Kingdom,
which maybe will increase forces or desire for further successionism, right? It might push Northern Ireland and Ireland closer together, and there is a slight rise in nationalism on the Irish island. Let's move from Ireland to Scotland. And of course, the elections in Britain in December 12 elections, where the Tories won an overwhelming majority. And of course, at the same time, the Scottish National Party did it incredibly well. They received an additional 13 seats, and they gained, so out of the 59 seats they can win, they won 48. In this context, First Minister and Scottish National Party leader Miss Sturgeon campaigned on vote for the Scottish National Party, vote for SNP, because a vote for us means staying in the European Union and leaving the United Kingdom. So here is the question. Breaking news yesterday was that Boris Johnson and the UK government denied Miss Sturgeon a Section 30 order in order for the Scottish Parliament to have a referendum, a legal referendum on staying in the United Kingdom or leaving. What is your take on it?
Well, I mean, the Scottish nationalists, let's start here. The population in Scotland is clearly pro-Remain. And that was clear in the outcome of the referendum.
In 2016 in Scotland have voted to remain in the European Union.
And Scotland is being governed in its devolved assembly by the Scottish Nationalist Party, which is pro-independence. For them, this was a strategic gift to say, okay, they had just lost the referendum on Scottish independence, but now they had a new reason to sort of bring up this topic again. And they've been trying to do that ever since. My impression is that there isn't a huge demand for this really in the population, but certainly political entrepreneurs who are trying to use the leverage that Brexit gives them to call for a new referendum. And it might eventually happen, but the British government has indicated that for now they are not going to support that.
Well, they are saying that you had that chance in 2014, because let's remember, in 2014, Scotland had legal referendum. They did receive the Section 30 order, and 55% of Scotland said we would like to stay in the United Kingdom. Many of these voters decided to stay in the United Kingdom because they wanted to stay in the European Union. So there is some irony to that.
That's what the advocates of a new referendum are pointing to, and they are saying, with some good reasons, that there's a new constellation now, and therefore there should be another referendum on independence. But of course, the British government is not keen on allowing that, because it would be yet another big constitutional issue that they would be dealing with, and it might well end in a majority for Scottish succession.
Do you think there is also a chance for Nicola Sturgeon moving forward with a so-called legally not binding or illegal referendum, not having received the Section 30 order, similar to what happened in Catalonia in 2017?
Well, we have to see how this plays out. I don't think immediately, but I don't know the Scottish scene well enough to really predict what will be happening there. I think a lot will depend on whether this demand for another referendum actually gets more traction in the population, in the sense that people are really upset about no longer being in the European Union. So a lot will depend on what will actually happen after Brexit, especially after the end of the transition period. Will there be tangible negative economic effects in Scotland, things like that, which could actually give the call for a referendum an additional push.
Yes,
I don't think if the call persists, the British government can in the long run ignore it.
Yes, I agree with you. All right, let's go back a little bit to the election. Was this a Brexit election? Or can we think of it as an election or a second referendum on Brexit, right? And we could say, well, there was an overwhelming Tory majority, so apparently the British really want out. Or was this a failure of Labour of mobilizing its base? Was it an issue where basically Corbynism or Jeremy Corbyn as a leader has failed?
Yeah, well, I wouldn't call it a second Brexit election. I do think, as you pointed out, that it was strongly about leadership, that more voters liked the leadership provided by Boris Johnson than the offers of Jeremy Corbyn, the Labour leader. But certainly Brexit was a topic which Johnson could use to actually bring out and clearly express this leadership advantage, if you will, because he had a clear position on Brexit and Corbyn did not. Corbyn had, throughout the whole Brexit process, really never managed to clearly explain his view.
Do you know what the rationale behind that was? Because to this day, I cannot really wrap my mind around being neutral. He said he's neutral on Brexit and then kind of taking a stance in the last week.
Well, on the one hand, he wanted to have the election on topics other than Brexit, and that worked for him in the 2017 election, where he did better than expected and Theresa May lost her majority, to simply say there's other important issues, social issues, and he felt much more comfortable campaigning on those. So that's a fair point, I guess. But after 3.5 years of this Brexit saga, people wanted answers to that.
They wanted to move on.
The Labour Party didn't really have any good answers. It also, in part, didn't have any good answers because it had rejected 3 times Theresa May's withdrawal agreement, which was very close to what the Labour Party had said they wanted to achieve. So they were in a very complicated position to justify what they wanted, because really what they wanted, what they had said they wanted, had been on the table. They could have accepted that. They could have had a very close alignment with the EU through Theresa May's backstop, if only a couple of them had supported the May's agreement. So in that sense, even if the election was perhaps not a rerun of the referendum, Brexit was an issue, I think, that brought out quite clearly why Johnson was perceived as the stronger leader to take Britain forward compared to Corbyn.
Yes, and then let's speak a little bit about those hardcore Labour constituencies, right? The red wall in England that turned blue. They have been some constituencies where never a Conservative candidate won in the last, 80 years, since 1930s, and all of a sudden Labour candidates were rejected and Tory candidates won those constituencies. Do you think that this is just a borrowed or a lent vote to Boris Johnson, as he also acknowledged it? Will they switch back to red in the next election? Why would they abandon Labour, other than being disappointed, of course, in Corbyn's leadership?
Well, that is one factor. Then, of course, the electoral system in the UK exacerbates that. I mean, otherwise we would have seen just a few percentage points drop, and here in a first past the post electoral system you can see the change much more clearly. And then, of course, there's a general trend across Europe of social democratic parties doing extremely poorly, especially in Western European countries. Germany, Netherlands, France, you name it.
The decline of the left.
Compared to those, the British Labour Party is still doing well, fairly well. And perhaps this general trend has sort of caught them too. But I wouldn't necessarily say that this is that the loss of these seats is irreversible.
Yes.
I do think that there were some very special considerations in this particular election.
I think Corbyn also shifted a little bit too much to the left. and not everybody was embracing his ideas of nationalizing industries or the internet, for instance. Let's come back a little bit to Canada. And the first thing that we should discuss, or I like to draw a comparison to, is the first past the post, right? Same electoral system in Britain, same electoral system in Canada. And just to talk about the recent Canadian elections, does this system disadvantage the left in terms of splitting the progressive vote? And we know that young voters predominantly opt for more progressive parties. Yeah. So did progressive voters in Britain face the challenge of, am I voting for the Liberal Democrats who wanted to stay in the European Union? Am I giving my vote to Labour? Similarly, in Canada, do I vote the Liberal Party? Do I vote for the candidate for the NDP or the Green Party candidate? What's your take on that?
Well, I wouldn't say that the electoral system generally disadvantages the left. It disadvantages those political, that sort of direction on the political spectrum that is splintered into very many parties. So while the Conservatives in Canada were split, the electoral system would disadvantage them. So, I mean, it clearly advantages attempts to form sort of larger voting blocs. And yes, the reality in Canada currently is that with the Greens, NDP, and arguably Liberals, and then in Quebec, the Bloc, and so on, there's more progressive parties than conservative parties. So for them, the electoral system can be
an issue. Yes. So let's go back to the original question. How is Brexit perceived in Canada? And is there a partisan divide? And of course, you mentioned there is one. Can you tell us more about this partisan divide?
Yeah. So as one of the first things that we did for this project that you mentioned earlier is that we commissioned a representative survey of Canadians, which Nanos Research did for us in late September of last year, 2019, to ask Canadians exactly that question. And the result was, first of all, that much to my surprise, actually only about 25% of Canadians said that they have any sympathy for Brexit. That was lower, I must say, than I had expected.
What did you expect?
I would have expected it more or less so 50-50 or something. But so there is not much, based on this survey, there is not very much sympathy for Brexit amongst Canadians. Now, keep in mind, though, that the survey was done at arguably a point which was, you could say, is the low point of the whole Brexit saga, because that was when Boris Johnson had just come in and had hit into the same brick wall that Theresa May had hit. So perhaps we have to factor that in. But nevertheless, it showed quite clearly that Canadians, the majority of Canadians, do not have sympathy for Brexit. Only about a quarter of Canadians view Brexit with sympathy. But the partisan divide is enormous. Amongst voters who usually vote Conservative, most would actually have sympathy for Brexit, about 46%. But so it's a plurality, but if you discount those who don't know and so on, it's a majority. Whereas the other parties are much stronger against Brexit. So if I recall correctly, only 8% of supporters of the New Democrats said that they had sympathy for Brexit. And interestingly, the supporters of the Bloc Québécois are unsure, and you can understand why. I mean, they don't necessarily like Britishness, but they like the idea of having a referendum to leave. So where these voters sort of are distinguished from the others is in the large percentage amongst the Bloc Québécois supporters who say that they don't know, they are unsure how to make sense of Brexit.
Interesting. Let's talk a little bit about today's panel's the topic, Brexit, right? Mm-hmm. So after the Canadian election, we could see that many social media accounts on Western alienation were trending. What can Canada learn from Brexit? Is Brexit a good idea, in your opinion? Is it a dangerous idea? What is the price of successionism?
Well, obviously, I'm from Ottawa. I'm from the East, so I come here also in part to learn and to listen about that,
Alberta.
To understand it. I mean, as a citizen, not necessarily as a political scientist, I cannot help but point out that up until about 5 years ago, Canada was governed by a conservative prime minister from Alberta. So it doesn't seem to me that this part of the country is not represented in the political system. So I see that with a bit of skepticism, that just because losing 2 elections to parties that do not tend to be preferred here, that should be a reason to consider separating. But from a more academic perspective, and where also Brexit comes in, I think my main message would be that it is dangerous to use referendums as a strategic game. So if someone is a convinced advocate of Brexit who wants to leave Canada, fine, they can demand a referendum. I would have a serious problem with people who say, let's call for a referendum as a bargaining chip to get more from Ottawa. That, I think, is extremely dangerous, and this is exactly, in a way, what David Cameron did with the Brexit referendum. He called the referendum wanting it to fail, but hoping that by initiating the referendum as a pressure tactic, he could get concessions from Brussels and sort of outflank, strategically, some other people in his own party and in other parties.
There's an excellent documentary on that, and I made my students watch it. David Cameron admits to maybe being overly confident that Remain is going to win, and it has cost also his political career.
It has. And so here, and there's actually some very good also sort of scholarly articles on how demands for referendums on European issues in the UK ratcheted up, how one party after the other said, okay, we will do this only if we have a referendum. We will join the euro only if we have a referendum. We will agree to the constitutional treaty only if we have a referendum. So,
and that's how the constitutional treaty failed in France.
It did, and the British were happy that they didn't have to have a referendum. But the idea of only being able to do something based on a referendum made it almost inevitable. For instance, Martin Westlake has argued that at some point there would have been a referendum. So it is dangerous to use a referendum as a strategic tool if it's not really your ambition to see the referendum succeed. If you want Alberta and Saskatchewan to leave, and you're convinced that that's the best solution, sure, call for a referendum, but don't use it as a strategic device if that's not really your objective.
So in this context, and studying democracy and studying legitimacy, you as an expert in EU studies, do you believe that referendums are a good democratic tool?
It's a difficult question. Yes, they can be a very good political tool because they involve the citizens in making important decisions on policy issues that can be quite useful. They become more problematic if the issue is poorly defined and therefore the a problem of sort of adequate information occurs, as in the case of Brexit or as in many constitutional referendums.
Let's remind the listeners that the most Googled question after June 16th was, what is the European Union?
Yes, well, exactly. And as we discussed, it wasn't really clear what Brexit would mean, what people were voting for. If it's a concrete policy issue that is easy enough to understand, I think a referendum can be an excellent device. It has been used at local levels to discuss infrastructure projects or so on, and there it seems to me that the realities and the options can be made clear enough, and such a decision can have legitimacy. But the issue is, if you're voting on something that is as undefined as Brexit, and Brexit likely would be similarly undefined, then it becomes very problematic because voters would not necessarily know what they're actually voting for, which means that they can very easily be misled by sort of emotional appeals, outright falsehoods, and things like that.
Exactly. So back to you living in Ottawa, right? What is the perception in Ottawa, as a citizen, but also as an academic, of Brexit and Western alienation, and Alberta in general?
Okay, well, I don't work on Canadian politics, so
So what do your colleagues think?
and I must admit I haven't really spoken to them about this issue. My sense is that there's a bit of disbelief, perhaps, at the traction that this has gotten, based on the argument that I was sort of presenting earlier myself, to say, look, up until 5 years ago, there was a conservative prime minister from Alberta. So the way in which it actually developed into a hot topic, I think, has surprised many in Ottawa.
Has it also scared many in Ottawa?
Maybe, but I think there's also really not necessarily full understanding what this whole thing will entail and how serious you would have to take it. I do think that the federal government does take this seriously and has identified Western alienation as a problem, but they don't necessarily have good solutions, as they are not willing to do what, say, the Alberta government proposes on issues like energy and climate change and so on. So I don't think that this is an issue that elites in Ottawa really fully understand.
I see. This is why they have to come to Alberta.
Yes.
Right. We will speak about this more. Our event starts at 3 o'clock. I'm very excited. Professor Hurrelmann, thank you again for agreeing to this podcast. This was the first podcast I have recorded in the political science department, and I will invite many speakers in the context of my Jean Monnet Chair. And I really want to thank you. This was very informative and wonderful to have you on the first podcast.
Thank you. It's a big honor, and thanks to everyone who listened to this.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to the first episode of Politeracy. We hope the rest of your day brings you peace, love, and happiness. Bye for now.